As this commentator reviewing a major history of this organization in 1867 said, the favorite method of California charity, it seems, is that of selling an article by auction to the highest bidder, with the implied understanding that after paying for it, he is to give it back again to the auctioneer to be resold to the same company. And now listen, O ye nymphs of tender or mature age, this being directed to the charity ladies of England at the time, who smile across fancy fair counters and preside over lucky bags, to that which shall surpass your most audacious devices, your wildest dreams of mercantile success in favor of your pet charities. And the reviewer goes on to list specific examples of this California method of charity. He described a bag of strawberries of Herculean size, with each berry sold for a gold dollar. A hare shot during an unexpected train delay and then sold and resold as the fundraiser worked his way back through the carriages, eventually raising $157, which was quite a sum at the time. A defeated political candidate who carried a bag of flour from town to town in Nevada, and by selling and reselling it, collected $40,000. This charitable buffoonery, the reviewer concluded, demonstrated the earnestness of the American people, since, as he concludes, none will deliberately and gratuitously make fools of themselves for that which they do not care for. Charitable buffoonery. For anyone who has been involved in fundraising, it's actually quite familiar. We know what charitable buffoonery looks like. From examples of jail and bail for the March of Dimes, where individuals get jailed, at least symbolically, and then have to buy their way out. This is a fundraising technique, I believe originated in the 1950s. Innumerable charity fund runs associated with cancer or other debilitating diseases. This is one of the ways in which, no matter how serious the cause, how devastating the illness, what is often linked to that is a form of fundraising that mobilizes sociability, fun, humor, comedy, self-embarrassment, all kinds of things. Now, at times, this kind of civic fundraising may have a more serious tone and may be linked to high politics, as in 1939 when former President Hoover comes back on the public scene to raise money for Finnish war relief. But even then, this was linked to a whole lot of wonderful parties, Arctic balls at the Rainbow Rooms, events decorated with Eskimo igloos and skis, and because they weren't quite clear on the geography, penguins as well. So an incredibly serious event, but linked to frivolity as a form of fundraising. And ironically, as more and more European nations were drawn into the growing hostilities in Europe, this actually provided an opportunity for French-themed balls, English-themed balls, each one accompanied by a particular cuisine, particular music, particular costume, as a way of mobilizing private funds in response to these international crises. This kind of use and deployment of past presidents, of course, continues to the present day, as when former Presidents Clinton and George H.W. Bush led the response to raise funds for victims of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Sometimes, however, presidents, serious causes, and parties all come together from the start. And this is no better exemplified by the Committee for the Celebration of the President's Birthday, which is what we now know as the March of Dimes, the source of those jail and bail parties. And in these images, you see this conflation of parties, frivolity, and even here, military imagery. So help to provide the munitions needed now to move up to the front with the Committee for the Celebration of the President's Birthday. So parties, frivolities, serious causes, and presidents, all of those come together. The organization that that English reviewer was making fun of in 1867 actually had most of these elements from the beginning: parties, frivolous fundraising, and serious national service. He was writing about a history of the United States Sanitary Commission, which was responsible for raising funds, organizing the production of supplies ranging from strange hats, knitted socks, preserved jellies, other kinds of preserved foods that would prevent soldiers from getting various kinds of nutritional issues in the field. Also mobilized much of the medical staff, and particularly the nursing staff that volunteered during the war. And we have an image of this almost pastoral, in fact, definitely pastoral setting of a sanitary commission nursing station at Gettysburg with its lovely arch in the forest. One would hardly know that a major tragedy had happened nearby. That's half of it. The other half were large fundraising affairs that employed all the kind of charitable buffoonery, the frivolity, the parties of fundraising. Now, when that English reviewer looked at this organization, what he was struck by was the incongruity of the funniness, the ridiculousness of selling and reselling a bag of flour or a hair shot when a train was delayed, and saw this as in some way unseemly when connected to the very serious business of war. Other observers, however, looked at this same configuration in the 1860s, and they saw something very different. John Stuart Mill, the British political theorist, writes to the organizers of this fair in Philadelphia that history has afforded no other example, though it is to be hoped that it will hereafter afford many, of so great a work of unselfishness, extemporized by the spontaneous self-devotion and organizing genius of a people, altogether independently of the government. It's not quite right on that last piece, but it's a strikingly different assessment. This joint effort that linked civic frivolity and war was understood as a kind of expression of the organizing genius of a people. Similar sentiment came in a letter sent by Giuseppe Mazzini, who was the leader of the Republican forces in Italy, trying to both bring Italian government into a democratic age and unify all the principalities of Italy into a nation. He writes a letter to the editor in one of the last issues of The Liberator, the great abolitionist paper that had published for many decades and then through the Civil War. And he writes asking, in a way that should be appreciated by Chicago alums, for a good, accurate primary history of the doings of the Sanitary Commission and all that tends to prove the immense vitality of your Republican principle. What you have done is so heroic that I feel the profound necessity of having it publicly known in all our countries, and especially in my own. He offers, actually, if he can get a copy of this history of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, he offers to have it translated and published and distributed all through Europe. Why does he think it's so important? Your triumph is our triumph, ours as small R Republicans promoting forms of democratic governance in Europe. The triumph of all, I hope, who are struggling for the advent of a Republican era. Our adversaries were pointing to the worst period of the old French Revolution as to the irrefutable proof of republics leading to terror, anarchy, and military despotism. You have refuted all that. You have done more for us in 4 years than 50 years of teaching, preaching, and writing from all your European brothers have been able to do. So one might think that the Civil War was a pretty good case of terror and anarchy and bloodshed. But nevertheless, Mazzini looks at the way in which the nation, and specifically the North here, had mobilized, and sees evidence, an object lesson, proof on the ground that small r Republican or Democratic government can actually avoid the terror that had followed the French Revolution. Similar claims were made by those active in the organization. In a contemporary essay on military discipline and volunteer philanthropy, Edmund Fisher says the whole of the American people, men, women, and children alike, in thus rendering their armies efficient, prove conclusively that the war is not carried on, as many in Europe suppose, by the government of a minority, but is waged by the great mass of the citizens themselves. In no other way can you explain the colossal achievements of this volunteer commission. So we have a theme here. A great work of unselfishness extemporized by spontaneous self-devotion and organizing genius of a people. A triumph of Republican. A war waged by the great mass of the citizens themselves. Mill, Mazzini, and Fisher are all pointing to a very different kind of conclusion to be drawn from this strange hybrid of philanthropic frivolity and the very serious business of mobilizing for war. What I want to argue is that what all of these commenters are seeing is that the way in which civic benevolence, voluntarism, civic philanthropy, voluntary fundraising, whatever you want to call it, the way that this had come to be used in the United States in the first decades of its existence represented a distinctive kind of solution to the problem of creating an American nation state. For there to be an American nation, this raised questions of collective identity and political categories. How does a motley crew of immigrants from many different places, as well as the indigenous population, how do those peoples come to think of themselves as a people? How does a political entity that's born in a moment of the rejection of political authority construct new forms of political authority that are understood to be legitimate? And how are the two linked? The hyphen in nation-stateness. In the rest of the talk, what I want to do is to advance three claims related to this central argument of the talk and of the book. The first should be obvious, that civic benevolence is central to the historical development of the United States as a nation state. It may be dismissed because it seems silly, trivial, peripheral. But if we take Mill, Mazzini, and Fisher as being onto something, it tells us we should really understand the kind of institutional innovation and institutional work that is being done by the linking of these forms of voluntary participation and fundraising to political purposes. This helps to explain, I argue, a couple of important things about the distinctiveness of American political development. First, the puzzle of how is it that a country whose history is often characterized by having a strongly anti-statist political culture nevertheless becomes a globally hegemonic power. That's a good puzzle to get your head around. It also helps us to understand how private or civic organizations become so centrally involved in the organization of governing. I'll then, at the end, sort of put forward two other claims more briefly. The first being that the legacies of these developments actually have a lot to say about the distempers and political conflicts of our own time, and that if we take all of this seriously, it has something to say about specific pedagogical responsibilities for colleges and universities. So let me move through this in three admittedly quick stages. What does civic benevolence have to tell us about the way in which a nation was constituted, about the way in which state powers of mobilizing resources and organizing authority were constituted, and how those were linked before I get to those final two claims. In this project, I join with what's now a well-established line in contemporary social science and humanities, which underscores the point that nations are not primordial, they are not natural, they are constituted. Key terms are invented tradition, imagined communities. So the sense that we cannot take France for granted. Belgium, certainly we can't take for granted. That Frenchness, just like Americanness, is a historically constructed collective entity. The United States, in its historical political development, faced a particular challenge on this score. It's the first new nation, to use a phrase from Cecil Martin Lipset, and it faced enormous challenges in terms of creating an overarching political identity. In a wonderful book called Albion's Seed, the historian David Hackett Fisher demonstrates how the very groups that were involved in the British Civil Wars, the English Civil Wars in the 17th century, come over and they populate different parts of the United States. So from the beginning, even with language and more or less religion held constant, you have legacies of conflict that get mapped onto this new nation. Those are then multiplied by more extreme differences of religion. We should remember that Quakers did not do well in Puritan Massachusetts. Baptists were exiled to Rhode Island. Pennsylvania was this odd island of tolerance dominated by the minority group of Quakers. You had differences of language, with German being spoken in particular by many settlers in the country, different economic arrangements, differences between native-born and immigrant, enfranchised, disenfranchised, free and slave, white, black, and Native American, different political ideologies. So any sense of the unity of an American people was really something that could not be presumed, and particularly that could not be presumed once the immediate task of expelling the British Empire had been accomplished. Then there were obviously challenges of inventing a new form of state to replace monarchy and articulating the two. Let me speak first to the way in which benevolence helped to construct a people. Even before there was a nation to which a people might be linked, practices of benevolence and charity start to be used for political purposes. In a really wonderful recent book by historian T.H. Breen, American Insurgents, American Patriots, he reconstructs the history of the Committee on Donations, which was formed to support the people of Boston after the British Empire had blockaded the harbor. Obviously, if your harbor is blockaded, people get thrown out of work, food becomes scarce, etc., etc. And what happened in response to that was that residents in other colonies, so at this point, there is no common political category of membership. These are Virginians, South Carolinians, New Yorkers, who share only the common relationship to the British Empire, start doing things that sound awfully familiar. They start donating pigs and sacks of rice and pipes of brandy. I'm not quite sure what one of those looks like. These get collected. The total gets published, linked to a particular community. This starts sounding really familiar. And all of this gets smuggled up the coast of Boston to help the people. Breen, in reflecting on this history, comes to what I would argue is the right conclusion. This is a huge charitable infrastructure that had obvious political possibilities. So even before there's a nation, there's a sense that one can enact being a people through this giving of charitable gifts. That sensibility is developed even more powerfully on the Union side in the Civil War, and was exemplified by their lead fundraiser, Thomas Starr King, a Boston Unitarian who moves to San Francisco and is the chief fundraiser in the Pacific. The Pacific had a particular stake in the country not being divided. They also had a lot of gold. They wind up contributing about a quarter of the funds raised by the Sanitary Commission. And King preached sermons on what he called the divine method of patriotism, which operated by evoking our noblest affections, working from particulars to generals. So what he means by particulars and generals is that he understood the solidarity of a nation as operating by the activation of my love of neighbors, my love of particular others in a community, and then an act of abstraction whereby I extend my love of others locally to think about my love of the nation as a whole. And through this kind of fundraising, he argued that immediate experience of being connected to others, of being supportive to others, could be extended to the nation. By the way, this effect is well supported in experimental social psychology, that kinds of interactions can then lead to a generalized sense of solidarity with and altruism towards other. The high point of this way of constructing a nation comes in World War I. So the model is there, it gets practiced, it's there in the Civil War. But there's a particular challenge in World War I, and we think of World War I as being entirely modern. It's not like the Civil War at all. But if you actually think about the lifetimes of the people who were leading the effort in the Civil War, the country was led by a Democratic president who was not only from the South, but who had really grown up in the ruins of a South still devastated by the effects of the Civil War. And of course, many of his generals and officials were the sons and grandsons of abolitionists and Union generals. So it's sort of a difficult moment for creating solidarity. They're engaging in a war in which many of the citizens of the United States at that point were one or maybe not even one generation removed from combatant nations in the European War. The Irish were not happy about standing by Britain. That's fundamentally counter to what it meant to be Irish at that moment. You had Germans, you had Italians, and there was no presumption that all of these hyphenated Americans could be mobilized in support of the national war. Women and African Americans were effectively, if not legally, disenfranchised through much of the nation. So this administration faced a challenge of mobilizing the nation in support of a foreign war when the whole question of identity and solidarity was very much in the air. And what they turned to is this kind of civic philanthropy, often imbued with frivolity and silliness, as a way of creating precisely that kind of enacted solidarity with the nation. And let me just work through a couple of quick examples. The accounts of fundraising during this period are full of stories of gifts from marginal men. Full-blooded Indians, in one case an elderly Cherokee brave who had fought for the Confederacy. So again, this multiplication of different mentions of being excluded from full citizenship, agreed to either give sacks of wheat or serve in the military, even though they are not required to. Another anecdote featured a mountain man, another kind of marginal man, who comes down from the mountains with a bear cub, playful, as gentle as bears can ever get, interesting and smart, and promises to auction the bear cub and give the proceeds to the Red Cross. From the Eastern Penitentiary in Philadelphia, inmate B1381, a life prisoner, you cannot imagine this happening under contemporary prison policy, offers his services to make knitting needles for the war effort. One really cannot imagine this in a contemporary prison. And the example that sort of captures this idea of reciting the multiple dimensions of marginalization and then arguing that voluntary contributions overcome this marginalization comes from a home service worker traveling in the South. And I've underlined sort of multiple dimensions of marginalization that get featured in this. A colored woman, born in slavery, never married, still living with her mistress as a servant, bent and white-haired and feeble. But with her gnarled hands, she has just learned to knit. And she's learned to knit a knitted washcloth. Again, like a pipe of brandy, one of those things we're not entirely clear what this would look like. Her washcloth has gone to France, and what has come back is a thank you note from a soldier. She cannot read, yet another dimension of marginalization, but the letter has been read to her. She knows it by heart. She can always pull it out of the bosom of her dress and read it to you. So here's this sense of a recitation of multiple forms of exclusion and then incorporation through the organization of voluntary fund raising. This also applies to children, and I won't go into this example in depth, but children were also actively incorporated in this in order to create a particular kind of spiritual, other-directed, independent citizen who would develop these qualities independent of the authoritarian exhortations of teachers or exploitation by parents. So what one gets is a sense of a nation united through this flowing of small contributions and small pieces of voluntary production. Small ragamuffinish boys, they could knit. And in a picture that's admittedly a little later, Mary Pickford, movie star, knit. Everybody knit. There's a sense that from a military perspective, knitting is the most useful thing that otherwise militarily useless people can do. So it becomes this very important way of actively engaging everyone in the effort. So in terms of constructing national identity and national solidarity, there's a very clear way in which civic benevolence, the mobilization of civic gifts, is used to sort of accomplish these two things. First, to actually highlight that Americans are a diverse people. They are not unified by common traits. They have different languages, different heritages, different properties, and yet, after highlighting all of that in these vignettes, they can be linked by the voluntary production and the giving of gifts. This is not simply an issue of identity, however. It also turned out that you could produce rather substantial quantities of resources through this effort. We saw that first in the Committee on Donations, also there in the United States Sanitary Commission and the Second Great Commission, the United States Christian Commission, which was an outflow of the urban YMCAs at that point. There were 19th century applications beyond the war, domestically. Charity organizations and community chests are organized by people who come out of the Sanitary Commission and have this model of linking voluntary contributions and citizenship. And it's also there in the distinctive American contribution to the International Red Cross movement, which is the idea that the Red Cross should not be only about war, but it can also be about natural disaster. The Johnstown flood is an important first example, as is the Galveston hurricane of 1900. These are places where a wartime technology gets used to mobilize national fundraising for a particular damaged place, creating a sense of national community. The result of all of this is what some scholars have called an expansible state. So by World War I, there's a very clear model of generating a capacity to act linked to the national government that is of a greater scale because the capacities of the formal national government are augmented massively by the actions and contributions of volunteers. A rather notable figure to illustrate this is that 60% of the cost of U.S. participation in World War I is raised through voluntary loans and donations, which is quite an astounding number. By January of 1918, what had been a small organization before the war includes 20% of population in its membership. That's over the course of about 18 months. I meant to look at the comparable timelines for the penetration of the iPhone, but that's really sort of massive expansion and incorporation in a very short time. One of the key consequences of this way of making a nation state is that it defies one of the truisms of contemporary political theory, which is that wars make states. This is a way of making war where at the end the state can be dismantled. All that voluntary augmentation of national state capacity can be withdrawn. And particularly in World War I, we have good documentation that this was absolutely intentional, that as the country moved into the war, leading political figures, leading business people were very aware of the danger that military participation would leave them with a much larger national state. They wanted to avoid it, and they turned to this familiar way of mobilizing. Now, this particular model of creating national power had an unquestionable master, someone who was the absolute virtuoso of this, was Herbert Hoover, who, when he runs for president in 1928, does so with the novelty of actually having created a campaign film titled Master of Emergencies, which was his persona for the election. And it was a persona that really was totally deserved. The film starts with the specter of hunger, imagined as the gray wolf, stalking across Europe. But, fortunate for us all, for 40 years, destiny has been training a man to meet this crisis, no one other than Herbert Hoover. And he really had an amazing life by that time. He mobilizes voluntary groups and voluntary contributions, 77 million to feed starving children in Europe, of which Congress appropriates 20 million. So you have this sense of a mixing of private voluntary contributions and public funds. He brings that back home in 1927 as Secretary of Commerce when he leads the response to the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. That effort combined $7 million of in-kind contributions from the government with $10 million in funds privately raised. So by the end of the 1920s, you have really powerful examples of how this expansibility of this way of building a national state augmented by civic philanthropy can create an enormous capacity that is used either to meet domestic crises or to engage and project American power abroad. At the same time, these kinds of projects, this mobilization of civic philanthropy, is also helping with the hyphen, linking the people to the work of governing. Volunteers, for example, in the Red Cross are responsible through what was called the Home Service of helping veterans to understand and apply for government benefits. So a voluntary group is helping returned soldiers understand what federal programs they are entitled to, and then to apply for them. Trained nurses mediate between distraught citizens and professional, large corporate hospitals. So this is the role of the volunteers. A bit later, when the Red Cross finally leaves Arkansas, when it's displaced by federal emergency relief, some of the volunteers say, well, at least we left Arkansas relief ready, by which they meant they had taught farmers in need to fill out forms. So this is a powerful way in which the state becomes articulated to a sense of the people. Typically, the story of private charity and civic benevolence as a key element in American political development ends about here. And it ends specifically with the Great Depression, which is taken as absolute proof of the inadequacy, the primitive quality of this way of organizing public responses. If you look a little bit more carefully, the story becomes complicated. Obviously, Hoover, as virtuoso of this method, as master of emergencies, which was a title he quite had earned by this point, he takes his familiar methods, he uses them to mobilize the nation in response, and the initial response is actually quite impressive. If you look only at the community chest returns, those increased from 49 million from 180 chests in 1924 to 372 million raised by 329 chests in 1929. But then there's a collapse. There's sort of a sense of exhaustion that we have dug into our pockets, under the sofa cushions, into the cookie jars. However, we have donated all our old clothes. We have had as many parties for the unemployed as we can. This is all there is. And there's a collective realization that resources are inadequate. Even, and I won't go into this in detail, even bankers are writing to President Hoover saying, you've got to do this through taxes. It is simply not fair to depend on the voluntary efforts of good people to meet a crisis of this magnitude. And so much of this retrospective account of the role of private benevolence during the Depression is told in terms of what we know its outcome to have been, namely the insufficiency of the private voluntary response, the sort of tragic, humiliating failure of Hoover as a political figure. But what I want to leave you with today, it'll be a couple points as I leave you with it, is to remember that it doesn't go away here. Instead, this powerful machinery of mobilizing Americans into national projects through private philanthropy actually gets revived and used quite powerfully by Franklin Roosevelt. That's the committee to celebrate the president's birthday, which becomes the March of Dimes, which solves both the problem of his need to pay a mortgage on the polio resort at Warm Springs, and, as he understood, a way to deal with public apathy, or what was called depression shock, a way to mobilize people around a doable project. And again, you have this kind of imagery of small charitable donations, my dime, your dime, linked in an army to take on the enemy of polio. He's also very aware that if philanthropic resources were inadequate for Hoover's approach, public monies are inadequate for a response to the Depression as well. And it's under Roosevelt that we actually get the legal framework for a greatly expanded role of private money. In particular, the 1935 Act is the one that regularizes business charitable contributions. And Roosevelt is clear throughout that state and particularly local private charities need to continue a major role, probably because he actually believed that, and certainly because he knew that federal monies were not sufficient to displace them. This patriotic philanthropy under Roosevelt reaches a high point during World War II. You get those parties for Finland, for aid for war refugees in China, which are not only immediate responses to the national crisis, but actually turn out to be a quite effective way of getting around the inaction of an isolationist Congress. He fully supports full mobilization of the Red Cross in the USO during World War II, and a private Gallup poll done for the Red Cross in 1943 says 84% of respondents, and this is a fairly representative sample, not perfectly, but 84% said they gave to the Red Cross. For a political or civic act, that's a stunning number. He also, for the first time, incorporates organized labor. The change happens after the war. Roosevelt, in moving through the Depression, moving through World War II, actually shows a surprising level of continuity with the methods of World War I and the 1920s, although augmented by a much more powerful state. But it is after World War II that the solidary dimension of civic benevolence is disrupted as corporate leaders defect. Instead of community chests, you have united funds that raise funds only in workplaces. There's suspicion, well-founded suspicion, that there had been an effort to continue this kind of presidential civic philanthropy as a way of strengthening the base of the Democratic Party. Second thing that happens, of course, is that even though many of the forms of mobilization for World War II come from plans left over from World War I, they sort of take the lessons and put them in place. As we all know, after World War II, there's not a dismantling. War did make a state in the case of the Cold War, and so the federal government remains very large. But what happens in the 1950s is a combination of progressive taxes and restrictions lead not to the expansible state in which voluntary contributions augment national power, but to a situation in which federal dollars and federal tax subsidies increasingly flow out to state and local governments and directly to nonprofit organizations. And so it's in the post-war period that we get a new model of charitable contributions, where rather than augmenting and expanding a national state in moments of crisis, the flow of funds, activities, and delegated authority from government to what had formerly been understood as private and voluntary organizations becomes quite routine. And just looking at the numbers are always questionable. It depends how they get captured. But you see, if you're looking at dollars, corporate activity, or numbers of organizations, that the upward inflection of the nonprofit civic charitable sector happens not when we would normally associate it with, which is the late 19th century, early 20th century, but it is actually a post-war phenomenon. This has powerful implications for contemporary politics, where even though our discourse is very much about pro-state or anti-state, what we actually confront is a system of governance in which states, markets, nonprofit activity, private voluntary fundraising are powerfully mixed together. And I think it also has implications for pedagogy. Because if our students are to be informed to operate both in a political discourse that still holds to very simple categories that oppose these ways of doing collective things, private or public, and yet they live in a nation, in a society where these are deeply and powerfully intermixed. Our students need to have a capacity to engage with those moral, political, ideological debates, and yet keep their empirical and practical sensibility, understanding that the situation on the ground is actually shaped by these deep interpenetration of ways of doing collective action, ways of accomplishing public projects that are often understood to be deeply antithetical. So I will end there. Thank you.